Picture a battlefield frozen in stalemate, mud, barbed wire, and endless trenches stretching across the horizon. 4 years, neither side could break through. Then, in 1916, something entirely new rolled onto the front lines. Loud, slow, and unlike anything seen before, it would change warfare forever. In this video, we will explore the story of the very first tanks in World War I, their debut, their impact, and the moment the battlefield began to transform. Close your eyes. Let the world around you grow quiet. Whatever the day held, let it go, now. Set it down gently, the way you might set down a lantern at the end of a long road. You don't need it anymore tonight. We're going somewhere else. We're going back, a very long time. To a morning when the world was still dark. When the earth smelled of chalk and rain and smoke. When a young man lay in a trench, on the western edge of France, listening to the silence before the guns began. His name was Thomas. Thomas Whitmore. 22 years old. From a village in Yorkshire that had a church, a butcher's shop, and a river that froze every January. He had brown eyes and mud on his boots and a letter from his mother folded in the breast pocket of his uniform, just above his heart. He had been in France for 14 months. And tonight, the 14th of September, 1916, he could not sleep. The trench stretched away on either side of him, disappearing into the dark like the banks of some long, forgotten river. Above him, no stars. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with cloud, and every now and then a flare went up somewhere to the north, a pale, silent blossom of light that drifted slowly, slowly downward, casting strange shadows across the broken ground of no man's land. Thomas didn't look at the flares anymore. He had learned not to. You watched too many flares, and you started to see things in the shadows. And once you started seeing things, sleep became something that happened to other people, somewhere far away. He sat with his back against the trench wall, his rifle across his knees, and he listened. The Somme had been going since July. Since the 1st of July, a day Thomas did not like to think about, a day that had arrived like a thunderclap and left behind a silence that somehow felt louder than the noise. He had lost friends on that day. Good men. Men whose names he still sometimes said quietly to himself, in the dark, the way you might say the names of saints. 14 weeks. 14 weeks of this landscape, of mud and wire and splintered trees, of craters filled with grey water, of the endless, grinding attrition of a battle that seemed to have no edges, no shape, no clear beginning or end. Just forward, always forward. A few hundred yards of broken earth bought at a cost that Thomas could no longer make sense of. He was tired. Not the tiredness that sleep fixes. The other kind. But tonight, something was different. He had felt it all day, a kind of electricity in the air. Hushed conversations between officers that stopped when the enlisted men came near. Supply carts arriving with loads covered in canvas, tied down with rope, bringing things nobody was allowed to look at. Strange sounds in the night, mechanical sounds, from somewhere behind the British lines. A low rumbling, like distant thunder that didn't roll away. Like something very large, breathing. Thomas had asked his sergeant about it. The sergeant, a broad Geordie man named Carrick, who had been a miner before the war and who seemed to carry the weight of the earth in his shoulders, had looked at Thomas for a long moment with his small, calm eyes. "You'll see tomorrow," Carrick had said. "Get some rest." That was all. "You'll see tomorrow." It was not a reassuring thing to say to a man who already couldn't sleep. But Thomas had learned to trust Carrick. Carrick didn't waste words. If Carrick said you'd see something worth seeing. So Thomas sat, and waited, and listened to the breathing dark. He thought about the letter from his mother. He knew it by heart by now, he'd read it so many times the paper had softened at the folds, worn thin as cloth. She wrote about the garden. The potatoes were coming along. Mrs. Henderson next door had lost her tabby cat and was inconsolable. His younger brother, Arthur, had been helping at the farm up the hill since the men left. She hoped he was eating properly. She always ended the same way. "We think of you every day. Come home soon, my love. Come home soon." Thomas touched the place where the letter sat, through the wool of his uniform. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to. He just touched it, the way you touch a stone worn smooth by a river, not for any reason, just for the feel of something real. The night moved slowly. Around him, some of the others slept. You could hear it, the irregular breathing of men who had learned, through long practice, to sleep in the mud, in the cold, in the noise. It was one of the strange skills the war gave you. Sleep anywhere. Eat anything. Keep moving. Don't look too long at certain things. A rat ran along the top of the far trench wall and vanished. A flare bloomed and faded to the north. Thomas closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest them, and listened to the low rumbling that came and went, from somewhere behind him in the dark. Tomorrow, Carrick had said. He must have dozed, eventually. Because the next thing he knew, Carrick was crouching beside him, one hand on his shoulder, speaking quietly. Up, lad. Get up. The sky was the color of dishwater. Not dawn yet, not truly, but the thick black of deep night had softened to gray. Somewhere a bird, absurdly, impossibly, was singing. Thomas stood, his joints aching, and took his place in the line. All along the trench, men were standing, faces turned toward the gray eastern light, rifles ready. There was almost no talking. Just that peculiar quiet that gathers before something large is about to happen, a held-breath stillness, like the moment before a church organ plays its first note. Thomas looked at the man beside him. A Welsh boy named Davies, young enough that he still got pimples, with wide dark eyes that missed nothing. Davies gave him a short nod. Thomas nodded back. And then, distantly, from behind them, from somewhere in the British rear, the rumbling began again. Louder this time. Much louder. It was not like anything Thomas had heard before, and he had heard a great deal. He had heard artillery barrages that shook the fillings from your teeth. He had heard the particular, unforgettable sound of a shell falling short. He had heard men shouting and men whispering and men saying nothing at all. He had heard the Somme in every mood it possessed. But this was different. A deep, clanking, grinding thunder. Iron on iron, moving. Something massive, moving toward them from behind, not a shell, not an explosion, something sustained, something with weight and purpose and a rhythm all its own. Davies said something under his breath. In Welsh. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. The men along the line were turning their heads, looking back along the trench, toward the British rear. And then Carrick said, very quietly, "Here they come." Thomas would try to describe it, later. He would write about it in a letter he never finished, in a journal he kept fitfully. He would talk about it, years later, sitting in a pub in Yorkshire with a glass of bitter, trying to explain to people who hadn't been there what it was like. He would always fail. Not because the words didn't exist, but because the experience sat outside the reach of ordinary language. Because some things, when you encounter them for the first time, don't fit into any category your mind already has. They make a new one. They open a new room inside you that wasn't there before. That morning, grey and cold and smelling of chalk and rain, Thomas Whitmore saw the tanks for the first time. And the world changed shape. They came out of the murk like creatures from a dream. Or a nightmare. It depended, Thomas thought later, on which side of the wire you stood. Great iron bodies, low and wide, moving on tracks that churned the ruined earth. Larger than any vehicle he had ever seen. Not sleek, not elegant, blocky and brutal, all riveted plate and angular geometry, with guns mounted in sponsons on their sides that swung slowly as the machines moved, tracking the terrain. They moved slowly. That surprised him. He had half imagined something that would streak across no man's land like a cavalry charge, hooves and thunder. But these things moved with the patient, inexorable weight of tectonic plates. Slow and entirely unstoppable looking. Like buildings that had decided to walk. The ground shook beneath them. The air vibrated with the noise of their engines, not a roar, exactly, more of a sustained mechanical exhalation, a grinding that you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. Men along the trench were staring. Some of them had been told. Some had not. Either way, the sight of them arriving, emerging from the grey morning like iron gods, stripped away everything else. Rank, fatigue, fear. All of it washed away for a moment in simple, stunned wonder. Davies was gripping the top of the trench wall, knuckles white. Thomas realized his own mouth was open. He closed it. Mark-I, they were called. He would learn the name later. 49 of them had been brought to the Somme. 27 had actually reached the starting line. Mechanical problems, the mud, the impossibility of moving such things across such ground, it had already taken its toll. But the ones that had made it were here. And they were about to cross into no man's land. Settle in. Get comfortable. There's a long story still ahead of us tonight. A story about iron and courage and fear. About men on both sides of a wire trying to understand something new arriving in the world. About the moment when warfare became, in some small and terrible way, modern. Thomas is watching the tanks begin to move forward. The whistles are about to blow. The morning of the 15th of September, 1916 is just beginning. And we have all the time in the world. There were 8 of them assigned to this section of the line. 8 Mark I tanks, moving in a loose formation, spread across a wide front. They had names. Thomas would learn this later, would come to find the names both funny and oddly moving. Clan Leslie, Dinnican, Dolly, D'Artagnan. The crews had painted them on the hulls in some cases, or it was just what the men called them, quietly, the way you name a dog or a boat. Something about the naming made them feel less alien. Or perhaps it made them feel more so, the way naming a very large, very strange thing draws attention to how large and strange it is. They crossed the British front line just as the barrage began. The barrage. Thomas had been through dozens of barrages by now. He knew the sound the way he knew his own heartbeat, knew the different registers of it, the deep belly thud of the heavy howitzers far behind, the sharper crack of the field guns closer in, the way the sounds layered over each other until they stopped being individual noises and became something else entirely. A weather system. A climate. A permanent feature of the landscape, like wind. The guns opened at 6:20 in the morning. The sky turned orange to the east, and not because of the sunrise. Thomas pressed himself against the forward wall of the trench and felt the vibrations come up through the earth and through his boots and through his legs and settle somewhere deep in his chest, just below the letter from his mother. The noise was total. It erased thought. It erased everything that wasn't immediate and physical, the feel of the trench wall, the smell of the smoke already drifting back from the German lines, the sight of the tanks moving forward through it all, utterly indifferent to the sound, indifferent to everything. That was the thing about the tanks, Thomas thought. They didn't flinch. Men flinched. Even the bravest men, even Carrick, had a flinch in them somewhere. An animal reflex, the body insisting on its own survival in the only language it knew. But the tanks just moved. Slow, grinding, implacable. The barrage fell around them and they moved through it the way a river moves through rain. He found that he was holding his breath. The whistles blew at 6:20. All along the line, as far as Thomas could see in either direction, men climbed up out of the earth. He climbed with them. It was always the same moment, the going over, a moment that existed outside of time, somehow, a moment where the ordinary laws of cause and effect seemed briefly suspended. Your body did what it had been trained to do. Your feet found the fire step, your hands found the top of the parapet, and then you were up and out and standing in no man's land, and the air was full of noise and smoke and the smell of cordite, and somewhere ahead of you in the murk was the German line. Thomas's boots sank into the mud. He moved forward. No man's land on the Somme had, by September of 1916, become one of the most thoroughly destroyed stretches of ground in the history of human conflict. 3 months of shelling had reduced it to something that barely resembled Earth at all, a landscape of craters, some shallow, some deep enough to swallow a cart and horse, all of them filled to varying degrees with grey water and debris. The wire had been cut and restrung and cut again so many times that it lay in rusted tangles across everything, ankle height, knee height, chest height in places, threading through the craters like some terrible embroidery. Walking across it was less like walking and more like climbing. Each step was a negotiation: find solid ground, test it, shift weight, find the next solid piece. Men moved in a slow, hunched shuffle, rifles held across their bodies, eyes down as much as forward, because a twisted ankle in no man's land was not simply an inconvenience. It was a very specific kind of disaster. Thomas moved. To his left, Davies. To his right, a man named Hollingsworth, older, a former schoolteacher from Bristol who had joined up in the first weeks and who wore an expression of permanent, mild surprise, as though the world continued to exceed his expectations in every direction. Ahead of them, through the smoke and the churned air, the tanks moved. Here is what the tanks could do that the men could not. They could cross wire. Not cut it, not carefully negotiate it, but simply drive through it, the tracks rolling over it, pressing it into the mud, flattening it. Men had been dying on wire since 1914. Caught on it, held by it, made into something terrible by it. The wire was one of the defining horrors of this war, the thing that turned open ground into a trap, that made advances into massacres. And these machines simply didn't care about it. They rolled forward and the wire went under them, and behind them a path was cleared, and the men walked through. Thomas walked through a gap the tanks had made and felt something he hadn't expected. Relief was too small a word. It was something older than relief. Something that had to do with an obstacle that had been, for years, immovable, and then was moved. Like watching a locked door swing open. Like breathing after a long time of not quite breathing. He kept moving. The German guns had found their range by now. Artillery shells were falling in no man's land, not the concentrated fury of a full counter-barrage, but a searching, probing fire, the German gunners adjusting and correcting, trying to catch the advancing British line. Plumes of earth erupted to Thomas's left, to his right, ahead of him. Each one a column of dark soil and smoke rising maybe 30, 40 feet before collapsing back down, raining fragments of earth and occasionally fragments of other things that Thomas did not look at. The men moved through it. This was the training. This was what 14 months had made of Thomas Whitmore of Yorkshire, a man who could move through falling shells with something approaching steadiness. Not without fear. The fear was always there, a cold wire running through the center of him. But fear, he had learned, was not the same as stopping. Fear was just weather. You moved through it. What he watched, as he moved, was the tanks. A shell hit close to one of them. Very close, within perhaps 20 yards. The explosion threw up a wall of earth that briefly obscured the machine entirely, and Thomas's heart did something sudden and involuntary, and then the smoke cleared and the tank was still there. Still moving. The shell had thrown mud across its hull and done nothing else. Nothing else at all. He heard Davy's laugh. Just a short, sharp sound, not a happy laugh exactly, more the laugh of a man who has seen something that his brain needs to release somehow because it doesn't fit anywhere. The tank continued forward. Inside those tanks, and Thomas would not learn this until much later, would piece it together from accounts and conversations over years, inside those tanks, the conditions were extraordinary. The Mark I was not a comfortable machine. It was not designed with the comfort of its crew in mind. It was designed to cross trenches, to withstand rifle and machine gun fire, to carry weapons forward into places where weapons were desperately needed. The men inside it were almost incidental to that purpose. 8 men, typically, in a space roughly the size of a large garden shed, but a garden shed made of 1/4-inch steel, with 2 6-pounder guns and 4 machine guns, engines that produced heat like a furnace and noise that made conversation impossible and fumes that built up as the battle went on until the crew were working in air thick with exhaust and cordite smoke. The temperature inside climbed past 100 degrees. The noise was so total that commands had to be passed by tap, a prearranged code of touches on the shoulder, the arm. They navigated by compass and by looking through small, armored periscopes at a landscape that gave very little information at the best of times and almost none in the smoke and chaos of an advance. The driver and the officer crouched at the front, watching the ground ahead, making constant tiny corrections. Behind them, the gunners worked their weapons. Everyone sweated. Everyone was half-deaf. The tank lurched and rolled over the broken ground, and inside, the men lurched with it, bracing against whatever was nearest, keeping their hands on their controls. This was the other side of the iron. Not the implacable, terrifying exterior that Thomas saw from no man's land. But 8 men in the heat and the dark, doing an enormously difficult job with great skill and, it must be said, tremendous courage, because the one thing the tanks could not do was protect their crews from a direct artillery hit, and every man inside them knew it. They moved forward anyway. The German front line was, in this sector, approximately 500 yards from the British trench. 500 yards. In the old arithmetic of the Somme, 500 yards was a number written in a particular kind of ink. The 1st of July had taught everyone what 500 yards of no man's land cost, if the wire wasn't cut and the machine guns weren't silenced and everything went the way things had a habit of going. 500 yards was not a distance. It was a reckoning. But the tanks were changing the arithmetic. Thomas could see it happening in real time, ahead of him and to the left, a Mark-I grinding toward a section of German trench, and the machine gun that had been firing from that position falling silent. Just stopping. Not destroyed, perhaps. Just stopped. Because the men behind that gun had looked up and seen something for which they had no category, no training, no plan, and had made the very human decision that the plan now was to be somewhere else. He would learn later what the German soldiers were calling these machines. Teufelskarren. Devil's wagons. Or simply, Die Ungeheuer. The monsters. Men who had stood firm through artillery, through gas, through the relentless pressure of months of fighting. Men who had proved their courage beyond any reasonable doubt, had broken and run from the tanks. Not all of them. Not everywhere. But enough, in enough places, to matter. The monsters moved forward. And behind them, walking in their tracks, stepping through the gaps they'd made in the wire, came the men. Came Thomas and Davies and Hollingsworth and Carrick and all the rest, following the iron, crossing the ground that could not be crossed, moving through the morning smoke toward the German line. Let that image rest with you for a moment. Men and machines, moving together across broken ground. The sky still grey. The smoke still rising. The noise still total, still enormous, still that great roaring weather system that had become the permanent atmosphere of this corner of France. And in the middle of it all, Thomas. Still moving. Still afraid. Still carrying the letter from his mother just above his heart. Still alive. The German trench was getting closer. He could see the shape of it now through the smoke, the dark line of it, the sandbags, the brief flicker of movement as men ran or repositioned or stood their ground. He kept moving. One step, and then another. That was all. That was everything. We'll stay here for a moment, in this grey morning, in this smoke. Rest your thoughts. Let them drift, the way smoke drifts. We're nearly at the German line. But that can wait. That's a story for a little later. For now, just rest. Just move, slowly, through the smoke, following the iron monsters home. We're going to step away from Thomas for a while. We're going to cross no man's land, carefully, slowly, the way smoke crosses it, the way light crosses it, and we're going to look at this morning from the other direction. Because every story has two sides. And to understand what happened on the 15th of September, 1916, you need to understand not just what it felt like to follow the tanks forward. You need to understand what it felt like to see them coming. His name was Friedrich. Friedrich Baumann. 26 years old. From a town near Stuttgart where his father owned a bakery, and where the smell of fresh bread in the early morning was the first memory he could reliably place, before school, before church, before almost anything else. Warm bread and cold air and the sound of his father moving around in the dark downstairs. Friedrich had been in France for nearly 2 years. He was, by any measure, an experienced soldier. He had survived the first winter in the trenches, which many had not. He had survived the spring and summer of 1916, which many had not. He was known in his unit as a steady man, not flashy, not particularly given to talk, but reliable. Present. The kind of man you wanted beside you when things became difficult, because he had a quality that was hard to name and easy to recognize. He did not panic. He had not panicked in 2 years of war. The 15th of September would test that quality in ways Friedrich Baumann could not have imagined. The British barrage had begun at 6:20. This was not surprising. Barrages began. They were a constant feature of life on the Somme, the way rain is a constant feature of autumn. Expected, dreaded, endured. You got into your dugout, or you pressed yourself into the deepest part of the trench, and you waited for it to end. You listened to the shells coming in, and experienced men like Friedrich, could tell a great deal from the sound. The pitch of the incoming whistle, the interval between the flash and the boom, whether the pattern was walking toward you or away. You read the barrage the way a sailor reads weather. Friedrich read this one and thought, Big push. The British were coming over. He had felt it in the days before, the particular tension that gathered before an offensive, something in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. He told the men near him to stay low and wait. They stayed low and waited. The barrage lasted roughly half an hour, lifting and shifting as the British infantry advanced behind it. This was the creeping barrage, a technique that had been refined over months, the artillery fire moving forward in timed lifts, the infantry following close behind the falling shells, trying to arrive at the German trench in the moments before the defenders could come up out of their dugouts and man their positions. It was an elegant theory. In practice, the timing was murderous to get right, and the ground made everything worse, the same shattered, cratered, wire-strewn ground that slowed Thomas and his companions was slowing every British soldier advancing this morning, stretching the time between the barrage lifting and the infantry arriving, giving the German defenders crucial seconds to recover. Friedrich heard the barrage shift. He counted. He said, "Up. Up now. Get to the fire step." Men came up out of the dugout, rifles in hand, blinking in the smoke-stained light. Friedrich got to the fire step and looked out. And that is when he saw them. He saw the infantry first. The long brown line of them, coming across the broken ground, maybe 300 yards out and closing. He had seen this before. He raised his rifle, found a figure in the smoke, prepared to fire. And then something moved in his peripheral vision that was not a man. He turned his head. He lowered his rifle. For a moment, just a moment, but Friedrich Baumann would remember it for the rest of his life as a moment that seemed to last much longer than a moment. He simply stared. It was moving through the smoke about 200 yards to his left, angling toward the German line on a diagonal path, and his brain, which was a good brain, a practical brain, a baker's son's brain that had proved itself reliable under considerable pressure, his brain simply refused, for those first few seconds, to produce a category for what he was seeing. It was enormous. That was the first thing. It was much larger than it should be, larger than any vehicle he had seen, larger than anything he had expected to encounter moving across a battlefield. Low and wide and dark, with a strange angular shape that seemed to belong to no established form, not a cart, not a gun carriage, not any vehicle in his experience. And it moved on what appeared to be metal bands that ran around its entire lower body, and these bands churned the earth as it came, and the noise it made. The noise. A deep, mechanical grinding that was somehow both loud and steady, not the sharp violence of an explosion but something sustained, something with the quality of an industrial machine, of a factory floor, of enormous interlocking metal parts doing their work without hurry, without pause, without any acknowledgement of the chaos around them. Friedrich's mouth was dry. He became aware that the men around him had also stopped what they were doing. One of the men, a young Bavarian named Schreiber, 19 years old, who had been in France for 6 weeks, said, very quietly, a word that Friedrich heard clearly despite all the noise. He said, "Was ist das?" What is that? Not shouted. Almost whispered. The question of a child who has seen something in the dark that the adults have not explained. Friedrich did not have an answer. The machine gun crew to Friedrich's right opened fire on it. This was correct procedure. This was what you did. You identified a target and you engaged it. The Milligram 08 was one of the finest machine guns in the world, and its crew were experienced men who had killed a great deal with it over many months, and they did not hesitate. They traversed the barrel, found the moving shape in the smoke, and fired. Friedrich watched. The tank, though he did not know that word yet, would not know it for some time. The British had gone to considerable lengths to keep these machines secret, and the German soldiers had no name for them yet beyond the ones they were already beginning to invent. The tank continued forward. The machine gun round struck its hull and made a sound. A rapid, metallic sound, like hailstones on a tin roof, except each hailstone was a bullet. And the tank moved through it. The bullets deflected. They sparked, some of them, against the angled steel. They did nothing else. The machine gun crew kept firing. And the tank turned, with that slow, grinding, inexorable patience, and brought one of its own guns to bear. The Milligram 08 fell silent. Friedrich looked away. The word was already moving along the trench, passed from man to man in the way that words move in extremity, quickly and in fragments, each person passing on what they had understood or misunderstood or half seen. Panzerwagen. armored wagons. Some were calling them that. Others were using words that Friedrich did not repeat, even to himself. Teufelskarren, someone said near him. Devil's wagons. Ungeheuer, someone else said. Monsters. These were not cowardly men. Friedrich knew them. He had lived beside them for months, had seen them endure things that would have broken lesser people, had watched them hold their positions under conditions that defied ordinary description. Courage, in the trenches of the Western Front, was not the same as fearlessness. It was something harder and more specific, the ability to function, to do your job, to hold your place in the line, in the presence of fear so large it seemed to fill the air itself. These men had courage. But courage is a tool. And like any tool, it works on problems it was designed for. These men had been given courage for bullets, for shells, for gas, for the proximity of death in its ordinary wartime forms. Nobody had given them courage for this. Nobody had warned them. Nobody had explained. And when the mind encounters something for which it has no frame, no category, no preparation, the body makes its own decision. To Friedrich's left, two men climbed out of the trench and ran. He understood it. He did not blame them. He watched them go, watched them run back through the communication trench, away from the line, away from the grinding iron thing that was now perhaps 150 yards away and still coming, and he understood, in a way that was very clear and very cold, what was happening to the defense in this section. It was dissolving. Not everywhere. Not all at once. The German army was not made of brittle men. In other sections of the line, soldiers were standing their ground, were finding ways to engage the tanks, were discovering, as would be discovered more systematically in the weeks and months ahead, that these machines had weaknesses, that they could be stopped, that the right weapon in the right place could do to them what the bullets could not. But here, in this section, on this morning, the tanks had arrived before the knowledge had. And the knowledge that these things could be stopped had not yet reached Friedrich Baumann's section of the German line. He gripped his rifle. He stood his ground. He was afraid in a way he had no words for. A cold, structural fear, not the sharp animal fear of a near miss, but something deeper, something that seemed to touch the foundations of what he believed about the world and how it worked. He stood his ground anyway. Because that was the thing about Friedrich. That was the quality the men around him relied on. He did not panic. The tank was close now. He could feel the vibration of it through the earth, through the walls of the trench, through the soles of his boots. Could smell something, engine oil and hot metal, a smell entirely unlike anything that belonged in a field. An industrial smell. A factory smell. Here, in the fields of France, at 6:30 in the morning, the factory had arrived. He raised his rifle. He aimed at the visor slit, the narrow armored opening near the front through which the crew looked out. A small target. A very small target. But it was the only vulnerable place he could identify. He fired. The tank did not stop. It reached the German wire, and went through it. Friedrich stepped back from the fire step. The tank was at the trench. Rest now. Let those images soften and drift. Friedrich standing his ground. The machine gun round sparking off steel. Young Schreiber asking his quiet question, was this das, into the noise of the morning? What is that? It's a question that hung in the air over the whole Somme valley that morning. On both sides of the wire, in different languages, men were asking some version of it. What is that? What does this mean? What happens now? The world was changing shape. It had been changing shape for 2 years, in the mud and the wire and the gas and the endless artillery. But this was something different. Something that pointed forward, into a future that neither Friedrich nor Thomas could quite see from where they stood, but that was becoming, in the smoke of this September morning, slowly, unmistakably visible. The tank was at the trench. Friedrich is standing his ground. And the morning is still young. We're going back to the Somme. But we're moving further along the line today. A few miles to the south of where Thomas and Friedrich have been locked in their grey morning struggle. We're going to a place called Flers. Or rather, what was left of it. Flers had been a village. It's important to say that clearly, because by the 15th of September, 1916, the word village required a certain generosity of imagination to apply to it. There had been a church. There had been houses, stone houses, the kind that had stood for 150 years, with thick walls and small windows and root cellars full of preserves. There had been a road running through the middle of it, lined with trees. There had been a school, a square, a cafe where old men played cards on summer evenings. The war had been here since 1914. The shelling had been systematic and prolonged. By September of 1916, Flers was a map reference more than a place, a name on a military objective, a set of coordinates attached to what was, in reality, a collection of broken walls, rubble mounds, and the ghosts of streets that could only be traced by the pattern of debris. But the name remained. And on the maps in the British command posts, the name Flers was circled. It was an objective for the 15th of September. Take the village, push beyond it, open a gap. The tanks assigned to the Flers sector had a particular piece of work to do. The tank's name was D-17. She was a Mark I, female variant, which meant she carried machine guns rather than the heavier 6-pounder cannons of the male tanks, 4 Vickers guns in her spansons, designed for clearing trenches of infantry rather than engaging fortified positions. Her crew of 8 had been with her through the long, difficult journey from the railhead, the careful, nighttime movements, the camouflage, the mechanical fussing and adjusting that the Mark I constantly demanded. Her commander was a young officer named Lieutenant Hasty. Stuart Hasty, a Scotsman, 23 years old, from Pennycook in Midlothian, who had been assigned to the newly formed heavy section of the Machine Gun Corps, the unit that operated the tanks, after being spotted as someone with the particular combination of mechanical aptitude and steady nerve that the role required. Hasty had never driven anything into battle before. Nobody in the British Army had. They were all, every tank commander on the Somme that morning, doing something for the first time. There was no manual for this. There was no accumulated wisdom, no grizzled veteran to tell you how it was done. There was just the machine, and the ground, and the objective on the map, and the training that had been compressed into a few short weeks. Hasty climbed in. His crew took their positions. The engine turned over. D-17 moved forward. The approach to Flers was, by the standards of the Somme, relatively direct, a long, gradual slope of churned ground, broken by craters and the remnants of 2 earlier German defensive lines that had already been overrun in the morning's fighting. The tanks in this sector had performed well in the first phase. Several strong points had been neutralized. The German defenders had fallen back, and the British infantry had followed, and now the advance was reaching the outskirts of what had been the village. Inside D-17, Hasty watched through his periscope. The smoke was beginning to thin a little, the wind had shifted, and there were moments, brief clearings, where he could see further than the few dozen yards that had been the limit of visibility for most of the morning. He could see rubble. He could see the line of what had been a road. He could see, in the gaps between broken walls, movement, German soldiers repositioning, falling back through the village, or taking cover in the ruins. He kept the tank moving forward. The road into Flers was still, in some recognizable sense, a road. It was broken, potholed, littered with debris, but the tanks had crossed worse. The tracks found purchase. The engine maintained its grinding note. D-17 turned onto the main street of Flers. There was an observer above. This is the detail that made what happened next something more than a private moment between a tank crew and a ruined village. Overhead, ranging up and down the front, were the Royal Flying Corps, their aircraft used not just for combat but for observation, for artillery spotting, for the crucial work of reporting what was actually happening on a battlefield too large and too smoke-filled for any ground-level view to capture. One of these observers, looking down through the murk and smoke at the village of Flers at approximately 8:30 in the morning, saw something. He saw a tank moving down the main street of the village. And behind the tank, following it, staying close to it, using it the way infantry had been learning all morning to use these machines, were British soldiers. Not a full company. A handful of men. Moving through a captured village, down what had been its main street, following the iron thing that had made it possible for them to be there at all. The observer wrote it down. The message was passed back. And in the clipped, practical language of a military report, somebody composed a sentence that would be quoted for the next 100 years. A tank is walking down the high street of Flers with the British Army cheering behind it. Pause on that sentence for a moment. Not because it is dramatic, though it is, but because of the word it chose. The word that person, looking down from an aeroplane at the extraordinary thing happening below, reached for without necessarily thinking about it. Walking. Not driving. Not advancing. Not moving along the road. Walking. As though the machine were a creature. As though it were doing something voluntary, something purposeful, something alive. As though the observer, trying to describe something for which ordinary language had no ready form, had found the best available word, and the best available word was the one we use for living things, moving under their own intention through the world. A tank is walking down the high street of Fleurs. It is a sentence about a machine. And it is also, somehow, a sentence about the end of one era of warfare and the beginning of another. You can hear it, if you listen to it carefully, if you let it sit in your mind in the quiet, you can hear the hinge turning. Thomas heard about it later. He had not been at Fleurs himself, his section of the line was a mile or more to the north, and the battle had a dozen different stories happening in a dozen different places simultaneously. That was the nature of the Somme. You were always inside a very small piece of something very large, and the rest of it reached you in fragments, in rumor, in the accounts of men passing through from other sectors, in the official reports that filtered down in the days following. But the story of the tank walking down the high street of Fleurs spread quickly. It spread the way particular stories spread in armies, not because they were necessarily more extraordinary than other things that had happened, but because they had a shape to them, a neatness, a quality of being a story rather than just an event. A tank walking down the high street. It had a beginning and a middle and an image at its center that you could hold in your mind, turn around, show to someone else. It was the kind of sentence that passed from man to man without losing anything. Thomas heard it from Davies, who had heard it from a Royal Fusilier, who had heard it from a supply runner who had come up from the south. "Is it true?" Thomas asked. Davies considered. "Someone said it," he replied. "And someone else said it after them. So it's either true or it's what people needed to hear." Thomas thought about that. He decided it was probably both. What Lieutenant Hasty himself remembered, in the accounts he gave years later, was not the moment of the advance, not the main street, not the cheering soldiers behind him. What he remembered was the noise inside the tank. The heat. The way communication with his crew depended entirely on touch and gesture because the engine made speech impossible. The constant small mechanical crises that demanded attention, a track that briefly threatened to slip, a gun mounting that needed adjustment, the ever-present fumes. The inside of a Mark I was not a heroic place. It was a workshop, a sweatbox, a machine room, the least romantic environment imaginable. And yet, somewhere inside that sweatbox, Stuart Hasty had done something no soldier in history had done before. He had driven a tank through a village under fire, on the first day these machines had ever been used in battle, and had come out the other side. The village of Fleurs, what remained of it, was in British hands. It would change hands again. The war had a long way still to go, and nothing was ever settled simply or finally. But on this morning, on the 15th of September, the thing had been done. There is a photograph. Not from that morning. Photography on the battlefield was a complicated business, but from shortly after. A Mark I tank, stationary on broken ground, its hull dark with mud, the geometry of it strange and angular against a pale sky. Around it, very small in comparison, figures of men. Standing near it, looking at it, some of them, the way you stand near something large and improbable, not quite touching it, just being in the presence of it. It is not a glamorous photograph. The tank doesn't look sleek or powerful in the way that later machines would. It looks heavy, awkward, industrial. Something pressed into service from a world that didn't quite expect to need it. But the men standing near it look at it with something unmistakable in their posture. Even in the stillness of a photograph taken over 100 years ago, even through the grain and the fading, you can see it. They look at it the way people look at something that has, at considerable cost, managed to work. The village of Fleurs is still there. If you were to go there now, to drive through the countryside of the Somme, past the chalk fields and the neat French villages and the long quiet cemeteries, you would find it rebuilt. Houses again. A church. A road. The trees that line it are younger than the ones that stood before the war, but they have had 100 years to grow, and they cast good shade in summer. There is a memorial. There is always a memorial. And somewhere in the ground beneath the rebuilt village, beneath the road where a tank once walked, and soldiers cheered, the chalk lies undisturbed, as it has always lain, patient and white, waiting. Let that image carry you for a while. The rebuilt village. The young trees. The chalk beneath. Things end and things are rebuilt and the ground remains, holding everything in its quiet, indifferent memory. The morning of the 15th of September is not over yet. There's still a great deal of story to tell. We haven't gone back to Thomas yet, or to Friedrich. We haven't seen what happened in the afternoon, or how the day ended. But for now, let the village of Flers be enough. Let yourself drift a little, following the tank down the high street, through the smoke and the dust and the broken stones, out the other side. Into whatever comes next. Not into the battle. Not into the noise and the smoke and the open ground. We're going somewhere smaller. Darker. Warmer than it should be. We're going inside the tank. To understand the men who crewed the Markai, you have to understand first how they came to be there. The tanks were new. Radically, entirely new, not an evolution of something that existed before, but a thing that had been imagined from almost nothing, built in secret, transported in secrecy, and deployed before most of the men who would face them had any idea they existed. The heavy section of the machine gun corps, the unit to which all tank crews belonged, had been formed less than a year before the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. The men in it had been recruited, in many cases, specifically for their mechanical aptitude. Engineers. Drivers. Men who understood how machines worked, who had grown up around engines and tools and the particular logic of things made of metal. They were a different kind of soldier, in some ways, from the men in the infantry. Not braver. Not tougher. Different. The infantry endured in an elemental, physical way, cold and mud and exhaustion and exposure. The tank crews endured in an industrial way. Their enemies were heat and fumes and mechanical failure as much as they were bullets and shells. Their battlefield was interior as much as exterior. 8 men in a metal box, working by touch and gesture, feeling the machine around them as much as seeing it. They had trained for weeks in England on ground that had been churned up to resemble, as closely as available imagination could manage, the terrain of the Somme. They had learned the quirks of their particular tanks. Because each Markai had quirks. They were hand-built, these machines, assembled with considerable skill but without the precision tolerances of later manufacturing. Each one was slightly different. Each one had its own personality, its own weaknesses, its own way of making its feelings known. The crews learned to listen to them. The engine was a Daimler. 105 horsepower, which sounds considerable until you understand that the Markai weighed 28 tons. 28 tons of steel and guns and men, moving across ground that had been broken and sodden by months of rain and shellfire. 105 horsepower to move 28 tons through that. It was enough. Barely enough. On good ground, with dry conditions and a prepared surface, the tank could manage perhaps 3 miles an hour. On the Somme, in September, with the craters and the mud and the broken earth, it was often less. Walking pace. Sometimes less than walking pace. But it moved. And the engine that made it move ran hot and loud and hungry. The heat inside a Markai in action was not the kind of heat you encounter in ordinary life, not the heat of a warm room or a summer day. It was an industrial heat, the heat of combustion happening close by, of metal surfaces absorbing and radiating it, of 8 working human bodies adding their own warmth to the enclosed space. Temperatures were recorded, in later accounts, of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Some accounts suggest higher. The men worked in this heat. They were soaked through with sweat within minutes of the engine warming up. Their hands found hot metal surfaces without thinking, because every surface was hot. They drank their water rations quickly and ran dry and kept working. And the fumes. The exhaust from the engine, in the early Markai design, was not perfectly contained. Carbon monoxide built up over the course of a long engagement. Slowly, without the sharp warning of a bad smell, carbon monoxide is odorless, it accumulated in the crew compartment, and the men absorbed it, and their thinking slowed, and their hands became less reliable, and they kept working because they did not always know what was happening to them. Several crews would emerge from their tanks after the battle disoriented, struggling to stand, having functioned under conditions that would register, if measured, as genuine poisoning. They kept working. The noise deserves its own consideration. Inside a Mark-I in action, the sound was total. The engine, the tracks, the guns firing, and in a mail tank, the 6-pounder shell casings falling to the floor every time the gun was discharged, a bright metallic clatter that added itself to everything else. The crews wore no ear protection. None existed for this purpose. They absorbed the noise the way they absorbed the heat, completely, without any barrier between themselves and it. Communication was therefore almost entirely nonverbal. They had developed a system of touches. A tap on the left shoulder meant turn left. A tap on the right meant turn right. Taps on the head meant different things. There was a code, a physical vocabulary, created out of necessity, for conveying information across a space of a few feet where shouting was useless. Think about that for a moment. 8 men in the dark and the heat, speaking to each other in touches. Passing commands and information through the pressure of a hand on a shoulder, the tap of a finger on an arm. Working together, coordinating, making decisions, all without a word, all through the body's oldest language. There was something in that, Thomas thought, when he heard about it later. Something that struck him as both practical and, in some way he couldn't quite articulate, human. That even inside the most industrial, mechanical thing he had ever seen, even inside that iron box, in the heat and the noise and the fumes, men were reaching out and touching each other to say, "Here, this way, I'm with you." Not all of them made it through the day. This is the part of the story that the image of the tank walking down the high street of Flers doesn't quite capture. The tanks were not invulnerable. They had been designed to withstand rifle fire and machine gun rounds, and in this they succeeded, as Friedrich's gun crew had discovered. But the Somme was also an artillery battle. And the German guns were finding their range. A direct hit from a field gun could do to a Mark-I what rifle rounds could not. Several tanks were hit that morning. Some were disabled. Some burned. The thing about a metal box full of fuel and ammunition is that if something penetrates it, if a shell finds the right angle, finds a weak point, finds a way in, what follows happens very quickly and inside a very small space. The crews knew this. Every man who climbed into a Mark-I on the morning of the 15th of September knew this. They had been told. They had thought about it, in the nights before, in the way that soldiers think about the thing they cannot quite afford to think about too directly. They had arranged it somewhere, filed it in a part of the mind where necessary things are kept, things that have been acknowledged and then set aside because there's work to do. They climbed in anyway. There was a man named William Foote. A gunner. 24 years old, from Wiltshire. He had worked, before the war, in his uncle's garage, learning engines, learning the language of metal and grease and mechanical cause and effect. He had a photograph of his sister in his breast pocket and a small, battered copy of Kipling's poems in his kit bag that he had carried since training. William Foote had a way with the Vickers gun that his commander noted in the first weeks, an instinctive feel for the weapon, for its rhythm and its needs, for the moment when it was about to jam before it actually jammed. He could strip and reassemble it faster than anyone else in his crew, and he could do it, after enough practice, without looking. Inside the tank on the morning of the battle, in the heat and the noise and the fumes, William Foote was at his gun. He would not have called himself a hero. This is worth saying clearly. The men who did these things rarely used that word about themselves. They used other words, duty, the job, getting on with it. They used the language of practical necessity, not of romance. They had been given a task. They were doing the task. The task involved a great deal of discomfort and a real possibility of dying, and they were doing it anyway, and in their own accounting of themselves, this did not require a special word. But William Foote, working his gun in the dark and the heat on the 15th of September, 1916, was doing something no gunner in history had ever done before. And he was doing it well. The tank that William served in crossed 2 lines of German trenches in the first 2 hours of the battle. 2 lines. Each one of those lines represented, in the old arithmetic of the Somme, an objective that might take days of fighting to secure, if it could be secured at all. Men had died by the thousands for hundreds of yards. And the tank moved through 2 lines in 2 hours, and William Foote kept his gun firing, and the crew kept their machine moving forward, and at the end of it they emerged on the far side, into ground that was still being contested but that was, undeniably, further forward than they had started. The tank eventually stopped. Mechanical trouble, The Mark-I was prone to it. A track had been damaged by debris. The crew worked on it for 2 hours under intermittent fire, in the open, with the kind of focused practical attention that you develop when the alternative is unacceptable. They got the track working again. They drove back to the British lines under their own power. William Foote climbed out of the tank and stood on the ground and breathed air that was cool and smelled of rain and chalk. He sat down in the mud. And for a few minutes, he did nothing at all. Let that be enough for now. William Foote, sitting in the mud. Breathing. After the noise and the heat and the dark, after all of it, just sitting. Just breathing. The simplest thing. The best thing. The rain beginning, maybe. Light, soft rain. The way it falls on the Somme, on those chalk fields, in September. Not hard enough to be unpleasant. Just present. Just cool against the face. You can feel it, almost. The cooling down. The slowing down. The way the body releases something, when the terrible thing is over and you are still, improbably, entirely, miraculously, still here. Still breathing. Let yourself breathe with him for a moment. In. And out. And in. The story isn't over. There's still the afternoon to come. Still Friedrich. Still Thomas. Still a great deal of ground to cover. But for now, just this. William Foote, breathing. The rain coming down. The tank behind him, quiet at last, its engine cooling, ticking gently in the morning air. Rest. We're still on the Somme. But this part of the story is quieter than what came before. It happens in stopped places, broken places. In the middle of fields where something large and heavy has simply ceased. This is the part of the story about the iron breaking. Of the 49 Mark-I tanks that had been brought to the Somme for the 15th of September, only 36 had made it to their starting positions by the time the battle began. 13 had broken down before the first shot was fired. This is not a damning number, given what the tanks were being asked to do. They had been transported by rail, unloaded in darkness to preserve secrecy, moved across country at night along routes that were barely suitable for horse-drawn carts, let alone 28-ton machines. They had been assembled and maintained by crews who were learning their machines as they went, who were mechanics as much as soldiers, who worked through the nights with tools and torchlight trying to keep the iron alive. 13 had not made it. Of the 36 that reached their starting positions, 27 actually crossed the British front line and engaged. The other 9 broke down in the assembly areas or in no man's land itself, stopping dead on the broken ground, their engines failing or their tracks shedding, becoming in an instant not weapons of war but large, conspicuous obstacles, stranded in the open. And the men inside them had then to make a decision. Imagine it. You are inside a stop tank in no man's land. The engine has failed. The track has come off. Some mechanical disaster, specific and final, has turned your machine from a moving thing into a stationary one. And a stationary tank in no man's land is a very different proposition from a moving one. A moving tank is terrifying. It is purposeful and relentless and apparently unstoppable, and even experienced soldiers have been known to break and run from it. A stationary tank is merely a large metal box. A large metal box that the German artillery will, as soon as they identify it, begin to range in on with considerable interest. The crew had 2 options. They could stay inside, which offered protection against rifle and machine gun fire, but which was a death trap if a shell found them, and which meant sitting in the heat and the fumes while the battle moved on without them. Or they could get out. Getting out meant climbing from the hatches into no man's land, into the open, in the middle of a battle, with nothing between them and the German guns but the ordinary fragile shell of a human body. Many of them got out. They got out and they tried to repair the damage, lying in the mud under fire, working on tracks and engine components with the same focused, unhurried practicality that good mechanics have always brought to broken machines. Some of them succeeded. Some did not. Some were wounded in the attempt. Some were killed. The ground around several broken tanks, examined in the days after the battle, told a story in small pieces, tools dropped in the mud, parts removed and set aside, the evidence of men working methodically on an impossible problem under impossible conditions. There was a tank called Clan Riven. She had crossed the British front line and moved perhaps 200 yards into no man's land before her left track gave out. It happened with the characteristic suddenness of mechanical failure, one moment moving, the next stopped, the track lying loose on the ground behind her like something shed. Her commander got his crew working on it immediately. They were in an exposed position, no cover, German snipers active, the occasional shell falling close enough to feel. The commander positioned 2 of his men as observers, watching for incoming fire, while the rest worked on the track. It was a repair that, in a workshop, with proper tools and proper light, would have taken perhaps an hour. In no man's land, in the mud, with rifle fire snapping past and the light fading and the battle moving away from them to the north and south, it took 3 hours. 3 hours. They got the track back on. Clan Riven started her engine. She moved. She drove back to the British lines under her own power, arriving after dark, her crew exhausted and half-poisoned by fumes and absolutely, quietly, matter-of-factly triumphant in the way that people are triumphant when they have fixed a difficult thing. Not all the stories ended this way. D6, another Mark I, male variant, with 2 6-pounder guns, was hit by artillery at approximately 9 in the morning. The shell came in from the northeast, at an angle, and struck the right sponson, the protruding housing that held the gun. The armor held against the impact itself, but the force of it jammed the sponson door and bent the gun mounting and started a fire in the oil that had accumulated in the lower hull. Inside, the crew had perhaps 30 seconds. They got out. All 8 of them got out through the hatches and onto the ground, and they ran, or rather, they moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, crouching low, heading for the nearest crater, which was perhaps 20 yards away and felt, in the crossing of it, like 20 miles. They made it to the crater. Behind them, D6 burned. It burned with a particular intensity. Tank fires are fed by fuel and oil and ammunition, and they produce a thick black smoke that rises straight up in still air, a column visible for miles, a signal to every artillery observer in range that something worth investigating had stopped in that location. The crew lay in their crater and watched their tank burn. The commander, a lieutenant whose name the records do not preserve with certainty, was heard to say nothing at all. He watched the fire for a long time. Then he turned to his men and counted them, all 8, all present, all alive, and something in his face changed. The men who were there described it differently. Some said he looked relieved. Some said something quieter than relief. The look of a man who has quickly, privately, rearranged what matters. The tank was gone. The men were not. That was enough. By midday, across the whole front, the picture was complicated. The tanks had done extraordinary things in places. They had broken through wire, silenced machine guns, crossed trenches, advanced further in a single morning than the infantry had managed in weeks of conventional fighting. In the best cases, at Flers, in several other sectors, they had fundamentally altered the experience of the advance, making possible what had previously been impossible. But the numbers told a more ambiguous story. Of the 27 tanks that had crossed the front line, only a handful were still operational by midday. The rest had broken down, been disabled, or been destroyed. The Somme had eaten them, the mud, the craters, the shells, the simple mechanical attrition of asking too much of machines that were, in September of 1916, still prototypes in every meaningful sense. They had been rushed to the battlefield earlier than many of their designers would have wished, deployed before the technology had fully matured, before the tactics for using them had been properly developed. There was, in the British High Command, significant debate about this. Field Marshal Haig, who commanded the British forces, had pushed for the tanks to be used at Flers-Courcelette despite the small numbers available. Others had argued for waiting, for accumulating more machines, developing better tactics, deploying in overwhelming force rather than small, dispersed numbers. The counter-argument, which prevailed, was that the Somme was happening now, that any advantage was worth taking, that waiting was its own kind of cost. History has never entirely settled this argument. What can be said is that the tanks achieved something on the 15th of September that could not be unmade. They had been seen by thousands of British soldiers, who had followed them forward and felt what it was to advance behind something that did not flinch. By thousands of German soldiers, who had faced them and felt something shift in the foundations of what they believed was possible. By the RFC observer who had written his sentence about walking down the high street. The secret was out. The age of the tank had begun. Thomas found a broken one that afternoon. He came across it in a shallow dip in the ground, perhaps a quarter-mile behind what had been, that morning, the German front line, now the British front line, or close to it, the line having moved in the morning's fighting. The tank sat at a slight angle, one track missing entirely, its hull dark with mud, a long crack visible in the rear armor plate where something had struck it a blow that had not penetrated but had left its mark. It was still. Silent. The engine cold. He walked around it slowly. Up close, it was even larger than it had seemed from a distance, which was saying something, because from a distance it had seemed very large. He came up level with the hull and realized that the top of it was above his head. He put his hand on the metal. It was cold now, cold as the September air, the warmth of the engine long since gone. The metal was pitted in places. Dented. Scored with long bright scratches where bullets had skated across it, leaving silver marks in the dark steel the way fingernails leave marks in wood. He ran his thumb along one of the scratches and thought about the machine gun that had made it, and the men behind that gun, and the moment when they had understood. He thought about Friedrich, though he didn't know Friedrich's name. He thought about the man on the other side of the wire who had looked up and seen this thing coming. He took his hand off the metal. He stood there for a moment in the grey afternoon light, looking at the broken tank in its dip in the ground. Then he adjusted his rifle on his shoulder and walked on. The broken tank stayed where they were for days, sometimes weeks. The salvage crews came eventually, working parties whose job it was to recover what could be recovered, to retrieve the guns and the usable components, to assess what could be repaired and what was gone for good. It was unglamorous work, necessary work, the kind of work that happens in the aftermath of every battle and that history rarely records. But some of the tanks were left. Sitting in their craters, half sunk into the mud of the Somme, they became part of the landscape. Men passed them for weeks afterward, going up to the line and coming back from it, and after a while the tanks became simply part of the scenery, extraordinary things made ordinary by repetition, the way anything becomes ordinary if you see it often enough. The mud took them, eventually. The Somme mud was patient and thorough. It took everything, in time. And the chalk beneath waited. As it always had. As it always does. The afternoon. There is something particular about the afternoon of a long day. The morning has its urgency, the sense of things beginning, of the day still full of possibility in every direction. But the afternoon is different. Slower. The light changes. The shadows lengthen almost imperceptibly and the quality of the air shifts, and the body, which has been going since the dark, begins to feel the weight of what it has done. Let yourself feel that now. The weight of the day behind you. The particular tiredness that isn't unpleasant, the tiredness that means the day was real, that things happened, that you moved through the hours and the hours moved through you. That is where we are now. The afternoon of the 15th of September, 1916. By 2 o'clock, the battle had changed shape. The extraordinary forward momentum of the morning, that grinding, smoke-filled advance behind the tanks, those first shocked hours when the German line had bent and in places broken, had slowed. This was always how it went. The initial success of an offensive was one thing. Holding the ground, consolidating, pushing further before the defenders could reorganize and reinforce. That was another thing entirely, and it was where the battles of the Western Front so often found their limits. The tanks that were still moving, fewer now, a handful across the whole front, continued to do what they could. But the coordination between armor and infantry, which had worked so well in the morning in the places where it had worked at all, was becoming harder to maintain as the afternoon wore on. The tanks moved at their own pace, which was slow. The infantry moved at the pace of the terrain and the resistance, which was variable. The two forces, interdependent but not quite synchronized, were drifting apart in places. And the German army was recovering. This too was always how it went. The Germans were, by 1916, experienced practitioners of the defensive battle, experienced and disciplined and possessed of a military system that responded quickly and methodically to ruptures in the line. Reserves were moving up. Artillery was being repositioned. The initial shock of the tanks, the Teufelskarren, the monsters, was being absorbed, not without cost, but with the grim professionalism of men who had survived 2 years of Western Front fighting and had learned that the answer to most new things the enemy introduced was regroup, assess, adapt. They were already adapting. The day was not over. But its shape was becoming clearer. Thomas was in a captured trench. A German trench, which was, he reflected, a very different thing from a British one. Not better or worse exactly. Different in its details, its construction, its particular character. The Germans were, by general acknowledgement, meticulous trench builders. Their dugouts tended to be deeper, sometimes spectacularly deep, cut 20 or 30 feet into the chalk, with timber-lined walls and, in places, electric lighting from small generators. The frontline positions were more solidly constructed, with better drainage where drainage was possible at all. This trench had been heavily shelled, the morning's barrage had seen to that, and what remained was fragmentary. But the bones of it were still visible. The careful construction. The thought that had gone into it. Thomas sat on what had been a fire step, his back against the chalk wall, his rifle across his knees. Around him, other men from his section were doing the same, sitting, catching their breath, drinking water, eating when they had something to eat. The particular suspended quality of a pause in fighting, when the body doesn't quite believe the pause is real and stays half-coiled, half-ready, while the mind slowly persuades it to unwind a little. Davies was asleep. Sitting upright, head against the trench wall, eyes closed, breathing steadily. Thomas watched him for a moment with something between envy and wonder. The ability to sleep anywhere, in any circumstances, Davies had refined this to an art form. Hollingsworth, the former schoolteacher from Bristol, was writing something in a small notebook. He wrote carefully, in his small, precise hand, and Thomas had learned not to ask what he was writing because Hollingsworth would say nothing, just notes in a tone that closed the subject. Thomas suspected it was letters. Or a diary. Something private, something Hollingsworth was putting between himself and the day. Carrick was talking to a corporal Thomas didn't recognize, the two of them standing a little apart, speaking quietly, their heads together. Carrick had that way about him in the aftermath of hard things, of gathering information, of accounting for the men. He would know, by the end of the day, exactly what had happened in every part of his section, who had been where, who had done what, who was missing. The accounting. It was always necessary, and it was always painful, and men like Carrick did it with a steadiness that Thomas thought was one of the most quietly heroic things he had witnessed in 14 months of war. They had taken the trench. They had taken the trench, and the communication trench beyond it, and a section of a second line that had been partially abandoned in the morning's confusion. They had moved, in the course of the day, perhaps a mile forward from where they had started. A mile. Thomas turned the number over in his mind. A mile. He thought about what a mile meant in ordinary life, a 15-minute walk, a distance between one part of a village and another, nothing in particular. The distance from one end of a small town to a church on its outskirts. A mile. And what it had cost. He didn't want to count the cost right now. He had learned, in 14 months, to defer that accounting, to put it somewhere, the way Hollingsworth put things in his notebook, to be addressed later, in a moment when the body had come down from whatever it climbed to during the fighting and was capable again of sitting with difficult things. But it was there. He was aware of it, a weight at the edge of his attention. The men who had been here this morning and were not here this afternoon. The names that Carrick would be assembling in his careful, private list. A mile. Sergeant Carrick came and sat beside Thomas. This was unusual enough that Thomas noticed it. Carrick didn't often sit. He was a moving presence, a circulating one, always checking, always accounting. When he sat down it meant something. For a minute, he said nothing. He took his helmet off and set it on his knee and rubbed the back of his neck with one large hand, and Thomas saw that his hair was grey at the temples in a way it hadn't been, or that Thomas hadn't noticed when they'd first met. 14 months ago. Carrick had been 43 then. He looked older than that now in the afternoon light. The tanks, Carrick said eventually. Not a question. An observation. The tanks, Thomas agreed. Carrick was quiet for a moment. Then, my lad, my son, back home, he'll ask me about them. When I get back. He'll have heard about them before I can write. He paused. What do I say? Thomas considered this seriously, because Carrick asked serious questions. Tell him they are slow, Thomas said. Tell him they are very loud and they are very slow and they smell terrible from the outside. He paused. And tell him that walking behind one this morning was the strangest feeling I've had since I got here." Carrick looked at him. "Strange how?" Thomas tried to find the word. He looked at the chalk wall of the trench opposite, at the pale stone of it, ancient and patient. "Like something had changed," he said. "Not the fighting. Not the noise or the danger or any of that. Just something about the shape of things. Like the world had shifted a little and you could feel it, even in the middle of everything." Carrick nodded slowly. "Aye," he said. "That's about right." He put his helmet back on. He stood up. He went to check on his men. The afternoon light was thickening toward evening. Across the whole front, the advances of the morning were being consolidated, confirmed, or contested. In some places the line had moved significantly, fleurs taken and held, other objectives secured. In others, the morning's gains had been rolled back in the afternoon fighting, the German counterattacks recovering ground that the British advance had briefly held. The net result, by the time the light failed, was a gain of roughly a mile across a front of several miles. Villages taken. Lines pushed forward. Objectives, or most of them, achieved. By the standards of the Somme, this was significant. By any other standard, by the standard of what a mile of ground is worth, measured against what was paid for it, it was a number that resisted simple interpretation. The British casualties on the 15th of September would be counted in the thousands. The German casualties, similarly. The dead on both sides lay in the ground they had died for, and the ground did not distinguish between them. A mile. Thomas took out his mother's letter. He didn't read it. He knew it by heart. He just held it, unfolded, the paper soft with use, and looked at her handwriting, the particular roundness of her letters, the way she crossed her T's with a little flourish that had always been hers, that he would have recognized anywhere. "Come home soon, my love. Come home soon." He folded it carefully. Put it back. He looked at the chalk wall of the trench. At the pale stone, cut by some German engineer months or years ago, patient and precise. He thought about Friedrich, though he didn't know his name. He thought about the man on the other side, the steady man, the experienced man, the man who had stood his ground while the iron came toward him. He was somewhere out there, if he was still alive. In a trench like this one, perhaps, or moving back along a communication trench, or sitting somewhere in the gathering dusk with whatever his equivalent of his mother's letter was, holding it, thinking about home. The war made it very hard to hate them. Thomas had found this from early on, and had never quite known what to do with it. The men on the other side were not abstractions. They were men. Doing, as far as he could tell, what he was doing, holding their ground, keeping each other alive, waiting for it to be over. He didn't know how to hold that alongside everything else. He had learned, over 14 months, that you didn't have to hold everything at once. You could put some things down, set them aside, come back to them. The mind was patient in its own way. It kept things. The evening was coming in. Around him, men were settling into the routine of the captured trench, posting sentries, eating what there was to eat, constructing the small, practiced rituals of security and rest that you assembled at the end of every day regardless of what the day had held. Davies woke up, looked around with the immediate alertness of a man who had learned to wake ready, saw that nothing immediate was required, and closed his eyes again. Hollingsworth closed his notebook and put it in his breast pocket. Carrick walked the line. The sky above the trench went from grey to a deep, soft blue. Not the dark of midnight, not yet. The particular blue of the last half hour of light, when the day is still faintly present but releasing, letting go, handing itself over to the dark. Thomas watched it. It was, he thought, an extraordinary color. Not a wartime color at all. Just blue. Just the sky. He kept watching it until the stars came out. The sky going blue above a trench in France. The stars coming out. Thomas watching them. Let that be the image you carry into the deeper part of sleep, if sleep is coming for you now. That blue sky. Those first stars. The day releasing its grip on everything, slowly, willingly, the way days always do eventually. The story isn't over. There's still the evening. Still Friedrich. Still the letters home. But you don't have to follow all of it tonight. You can rest here, if you want to. In the blue hour. In the quiet after everything. Let the day go. Whatever is still turning in your mind from your own day, the things said or unsaid, the things done or left undone, let them go gently, the way you release a breath. They'll be there tomorrow if you need them. Tonight they can rest. We're in the evening now. The 15th of September is nearly over. And in the quiet of the evening, we can begin to ask the question that battles always eventually raise. What was won? It is a question that never has a simple answer. In the immediate, practical sense, the sense that the generals used, the sense of maps and objectives and colored lines, a good deal was won on the 15th of September, 1916. The village of Flers was in British hands. The villages of Martinpuich and Corslet had been taken. A front of roughly 6 miles had advanced, in places, by more than a mile, in some sectors by considerably more, in others by less. German defensive lines that had resisted previous attacks had been broken. Objectives that had been circled on planning maps for weeks had been reached, and passed, and left behind. By the standards of the Battle of the Somme, which had been grinding forward since the 1st of July at a cost that stripped the word gain of most of its ordinary meaning, the 15th of September was a good day. The tanks had been part of that. An important part, not the only part, not the decisive part in some clean, uncomplicated sense, but a real part. In the sectors where they had functioned and where the coordination with infantry had held, they had done things that would not have happened without them. Positions taken without the casualties that would otherwise have been required. Ground crossed that could not have been crossed. The wire that had stopped men dead since 1914 simply rolled flat. This was not nothing. In a battle where nothing had been gained cheaply or easily, this was a significant kind of something. But Field Marshal Haig knew, even as the reports came in on the evening of the 15th, that the day had not broken the line. This was the deeper goal, always, on the Somme, the deeper goal. Not a mile, not a village, not an objective on a map. The break. The moment when the German line didn't bend but shattered. When the cavalry, the thousands of horsemen that had been held in reserve since July, waiting for the gap that never quite opened, could pour through into the open country beyond, and the static war of trenches could become, once again, a war of movement. The gap had not opened. The tanks had gone forward, and the infantry had followed, and ground had been taken. But the German army had not broken. It had bent, and it had absorbed the shock, and by the evening of the 15th its reserves were moving up and its artillery was repositioning and the gap, such as it was, had closed again. Haig wrote in his diary that evening. He recorded his satisfaction with the day's results. He also recorded his belief that the tanks, though promising, required greater numbers and better tactics to achieve their full potential. He was right on both counts. This is one of the uncomfortable things about Haig, that his judgments were often correct in their analysis while being enormously costly in their application. He was right that more tanks, better coordinated, would achieve more. The war would eventually prove this, in the battles of 1917 and 1918, at Cambrai and Amiens, when the tanks came not in dozens but in hundreds, and the line did finally break. But that was still 2 years away. On the evening of the 15th of September, 1916, Haig had what he had. A mile of ground. A new weapon proven in combat for the first time. And a war that still had, though nobody knew it then, more than 2 years left to run. Across the lines, in the German command posts, the assessment was different in its details but similar in its shape. The German High Command had been shaken. Not by the mile of ground could be recovered or new positions established, but by the tanks. By the fact of them. By the intelligence reports filtering in from the front, from men who had faced them, describing machines that bullets could not stop and that had demonstrated, in their slow grinding advance, a new kind of capability that the German army did not yet possess. Decisions were made quickly. Orders went out. Engineers and designers were consulted. The German army, which was in many respects the most professionally capable military force in the world in 1916, understood what it had seen and began immediately to think about responses. Anti-tank artillery, armor-piercing rounds for rifles and machine guns. And, eventually, their own tanks, the A7V, which would appear in 1918, too late and in too few numbers, but which was a direct response to the machines that had walked down the high street of Flers. The tanks had started a conversation that would last not just for the rest of the war, but for a century. The conversation between the armored vehicle and the weapon designed to stop it. That conversation is still ongoing. Every tank built since 1916, and every weapon built to defeat it, is in some direct line of descent from the Mark I machines that crossed no man's land on a grey September morning. Technology makes long arguments. There is another kind of winning that doesn't show up in maps or diaries. It lives in people. Consider Thomas. Consider what the 15th of September had done to the inside of Thomas Whitmore, not to his body, which was bruised and exhausted and full of the aches of a long day's fighting, but to the part of him that was not his body. The part that understood things. He had seen something today that he had not seen before. Had felt something change, not in the world exactly, but in his model of the world, in the assumptions he carried about what was possible and what wasn't. He had followed an iron machine across no man's land. He had walked through wire that should have stopped him and didn't. He had covered ground, in a morning, that the old arithmetic said couldn't be covered. The old arithmetic was wrong. He hadn't known it was wrong, in the specific way it was wrong, until today. And now he did. And knowing it, even here, even in the middle of everything, even exhausted in a captured trench with a dead man's fire step under him and the evening coming in, knowing it did something. It didn't make him optimistic. He was 14 months past optimism, past the particular bright certainty of August 1914 that had sent so many men in so many countries to train stations with flowers in their buttonholes. He wasn't that anymore. He wasn't sure he'd ever be that again. But it was something adjacent to hope. A small, careful thing. Not the loud hope of beginnings but the quiet hope of a man who has seen, in the middle of a very long and very dark thing, something that suggests, not promises, not guarantees, but suggests that the dark might not be permanent. Something was changing. Slowly. At enormous cost. With no clean resolution in sight. But changing. He held that. The way you hold something small and warm in your hands on a cold day, not tightly, not desperately, but present to it. Grateful for it. Friedrich, too, was doing a kind of accounting. He had made it through the day. He was in a rear position now. The front line he had defended that morning was gone, British held, and the German forces in his sector had fallen back to a secondary position established 2 months ago against exactly this kind of eventuality. The retreat had been orderly. Not the disintegration that the tanks had caused in some sectors, but a disciplined withdrawal to prepared ground. The kind of thing the German army was, in 1916, very good at. He had lost men. He would not count them now. That was for the morning, for the lists, for the correspondence that nobody wanted to write and that somebody always had to. Tonight it was enough to know that some had been lost and he himself had not. He sat against the wall of the new trench and thought about the tank. Not with hatred. He was too tired for hatred, and besides, hatred required a kind of engagement with the thing you hated that he didn't feel. What he felt was closer to the feeling he'd had as a boy when his father had first shown him an automobile. That particular mix of discomfort and fascination that new machines produced, the sense of the world expanding into a shape that wasn't quite the shape you'd grown up with. He thought about the bullet he'd fired at the visor slit. He didn't know if it had found its mark. He thought it probably hadn't. He had fired it because it was the right thing to do, not because he'd believed, exactly, that it would stop the machine. He thought about the men inside it. He had not thought about them in the moment. In the moment there had been no time for thinking about anything except the immediate problem. But now, in the evening quiet, he thought about them, 8 men, he'd been told by someone who'd encountered a disabled one, sitting in the heat and the noise inside that iron shell, working their guns, moving toward him. Doing their duty. The way he was doing his. He didn't know what to do with that thought. He filed it. The way Thomas was filing things, a mile away in the evening dark. Neither of them knowing the other existed, both of them putting the difficult things in the place where difficult things go when there is no time to properly address them and you are still, somehow, alive. The stars were out now. The same stars. Over the British lines and the German lines and the mile of ground between them that had changed hands in a day. Over the broken tanks sitting in their craters. Over the village of Flers, taken and held. Over the chalk fields of the Somme, pale and patient. The same stars that had been there before the war. That would be there after it. They didn't care about miles. They didn't care about tanks or wire or the particular shape of this particular catastrophe. They just burned, the way they always burned, indifferent and permanent, and looked at in the right way, in the right mood, in the exhausted quiet of a long day's ending, almost comforting. Almost. Because they were the same. And the same, after a day like this, was something. Rest now. The accounting is done for tonight. The maps are marked, the lines redrawn, the reports written in the command posts behind both lines. A mile. Whatever a mile is worth, and whatever it cost, it has been bought and paid for, and it belongs to the day now, to the permanent record of the 15th of September, 1916. Let it go. Let Thomas rest in his trench under his stars. Let Friedrich rest in his. Let William Foote sleep wherever he is sleeping, and Stuart Hasty, and all the others, the named and the unnamed, the living and the not. Let the Somme be quiet for a little while. The story has a few more things to say. But they can wait. They can wait until you're ready. The night has settled fully now. Whatever light remained is gone. The sky is dark and deep above the Somme, above the chalk fields, above the captured villages and the broken tanks and the men in their trenches on both sides of the new, redrawn line. And in the dark, in the small hours of the night following the 15th of September, in dugouts and captured positions, in aid posts and rear areas, men are writing. This is what soldiers do after the big days. They write. Not all of them, and not always, and not every letter gets sent. But the impulse is real and widespread and very human, the need to reach across the distance and touch the people who are waiting, to say, I am still here. I want you to know I am still here. Thomas found a stub of pencil and a piece of paper torn from a ration book and began. Dear Mother. He paused. This was always the hardest part. Not the writing, the starting. The gap between the world inside the letter and the world outside it, the gap he had to somehow bridge every time he picked up a pencil. His mother, in Yorkshire, in the house with the garden and the frozen river and Mrs. Henderson and her missing cat. And him, here, in a captured German trench on the Somme, with the sound of occasional shell fire in the distance and Davies snoring beside him and the smell of chalk and smoke and the particular smell of a trench that has recently changed hands. How do you put those two worlds on the same piece of paper? The answer, Thomas had discovered over 14 months, was that you didn't. You didn't try to put the whole world in the letter. You chose, very carefully, the parts of the world that the letter could hold. You built a small, portable version of reality, true in its details, incomplete in its totality, and you sent it home, and you trusted the person on the other side to receive it with the understanding that it was not the whole of things, only the part of things that could be given. He wrote, I hope you and Arthur are well and that the garden is coming along as you hoped. He paused. He wrote, we had a difficult day today, but I am well and uninjured and in good spirits. He paused again. Looked at the word spirits. Decided to leave it. Something new happened today that I am not sure I am able to explain properly. There were machines, large iron machines, like nothing I have seen before. They went ahead of us. I followed one across the ground this morning, and I want to tell you that it was the strangest thing I have experienced here, which is saying a great deal. I cannot say much more than that because of what we are allowed to write. This was true. Censorship was real and enforced. Officers read the men's letters before they were sent, and anything that could be useful to the enemy was removed or the letter withheld entirely. The tanks were not a secret anymore, not after today, but Thomas was cautious by habit. I keep your letter with me always. I read it often. Give my love to Arthur. Tell him to keep helping at the farm. Your loving son, Thomas. He folded the letter. He would find an envelope tomorrow. He put the folded paper in his breast pocket, next to hers. Hollingsworth had already finished 2 letters by the time Thomas folded his. This was not surprising. Hollingsworth was a school teacher. Words were his material, his medium, the thing he was most at home in. He wrote quickly and with evident ease, filling the small pages with his neat, precise hand, and when he sealed the letters he held them for a moment before setting them aside. He was writing to his wife. And to a colleague at the school in Bristol, a friend, a man he had argued with pleasantly about books for years, the kind of friend whose company consists largely of the exchange of ideas and who is therefore, in some ways, most present in writing. His letter to his wife was, like Thomas's letter to his mother, carefully constructed. Not dishonest, Hollingsworth was not capable of the kind of deliberate untruth that some men employed, a cheerful fiction maintained over months and years to protect the people at home from the reality of where they were. He was too honest for that, too constitutionally unable to say things he didn't believe. But honesty, he had found, was not the same as completeness. You could be entirely honest in everything you said and still leave the most important things unsaid. He wrote about the countryside. There was, even on the Somme countryside, the chalk fields, the autumn colors beginning to appear in the trees that had not been shelled, the particular quality of the French light in September. He wrote about it because it was real and because she would appreciate it and because writing about it reminded him that it was there, that the world was not entirely made of the things that the war was made of. He wrote, at the end, "I think about the classroom often. I think about October mornings there, the smell of the room, the children coming in with cold faces from the walk. I think I will be glad to go back to it. I think I will find it sufficient, when I go back, in a way I perhaps did not before." He sealed the letter. He held it. He set it aside. Across the lines, Friedrich was also writing. He wrote to his wife, Martha, a woman from his own town, whom he had known since they were children, whom he had married 3 years before the war in the church where both of them had been baptized. They had a daughter, 2 years old now. Her name was Hilda, and he had a photograph of her that he had not looked at today, would not look at tonight, because there were days when looking at the photograph made things easier and days when it made things much harder, and this had been the second kind of day. He wrote, "Martha, I am well and safe, which is the first and most important thing. Today was difficult. I will not write about it in detail, but I want you to know that I am uninjured and with my unit and in reasonable health, all things considered." He paused for a long time. "I have been thinking this evening about the bakery. About the smell of it in the early morning, before anyone else is up. I have been thinking about the way the light comes in through the side window in winter, that low, pale light, and the warmth from the oven, and the smell. I think about it often. I think it is the thing I think about most. Give Hilda a kiss from her father. Tell her I will be home." He stopped. He looked at what he had written. "Tell her I will be home." He had written it before he decided whether to write it, the hand getting ahead of the mind, putting down the thing that wanted most to be put down. He left it. He couldn't take it back, and besides, he believed it. He had to believe it. "Tell her I will be home." He sealed the letter. There is something remarkable about these letters, taken as a whole, not just Thomas's and Hollingsworth's and Friedrich's, but all of them, the millions of letters that moved between the Western Front and the homes behind it over 4 years of war. What is remarkable is not what they say but what they don't say. They don't say, "I am afraid." They don't say, "I am not sure I can keep doing this." They don't say, "Some days I cannot remember what normal feels like." Not because these things weren't true. They were true. They were true for almost everyone. The fear, the doubt, the exhaustion, the erosion of the ordinary, all of it was real, was felt, was carried by the men and women on both sides of every letter. But they didn't write it. Almost universally, across languages and nationalities and social classes and all the other things that divided the people writing these letters, they didn't write the worst of it home. Why not? It's a question worth sitting with. Partly it was the censorship, officers reading letters, removing anything militarily sensitive. But that doesn't explain the emotional omissions. Nobody would have crossed out "I am afraid." It was something else. Something more human than censorship. It was protection. These men, and the women who wrote back to them, who had their own version of the same omission, who did not write about the nights of worry, the mornings of dread, the particular silence of a household waiting for news, were protecting each other. Across the distance, through the paper and the pencil and the envelope and the military postal system that somehow, remarkably, kept functioning through 4 years of war, they were reaching out their hands and saying, "I am going to give you something you can hold without it breaking you. Because I need you to be whole. Because you are what whole looks like, from here." Thomas needed his mother to be in her garden with her potatoes and her neighbor's cat. He needed that to be true and intact and normal, and so he sent her letters that kept it so, not because he was deceiving her, but because he was preserving something. He was keeping the ordinary world ordinary, keeping it safe, keeping it somewhere he could return to. The letters were lifelines in both directions. The letters got home. Most of them, eventually, got home. The military postal service of the First World War was one of its genuine logistical achievements, millions of pieces of mail, moving reliably between the front and the home, in both directions, throughout the war. It seems almost incongruous alongside everything else. The chaos of the Somme. The mud. The shells. And somewhere behind all of it, men carefully sorting letters into bags, putting them on lorries, getting them to trains, getting them to ships, getting them to doors. Thomas's mother would read his letter in perhaps 4 days. She would read it at the kitchen table, in the morning, with her tea. She would read about the strange iron machines and not quite understand them but understand the tone, the particular quality of "I am well" from a man who was perhaps not entirely well, and she would fold it and put it with the others in the tin box she kept on the shelf. She would write back immediately. The same day. She would write about the garden, and Arthur, and Mrs. Henderson, and the river, and the first cold mornings. She would end, as she always ended. "Come home soon, my love. Come home soon." And he would receive it, perhaps 10 days after the 15th of September, in some other trench on some other part of the line. And he would read it and fold it and put it in his breast pocket, above his heart. And he would keep going. Letters traveling between two worlds. People reaching across impossible distances to say the things that matter most and carefully leaving out the things that would hurt too much. "I am still here. Come home soon." Let those words settle in you as you drift. They are old words now, words spoken by people who have been gone for 100 years. But they are also the oldest words. The ones that don't change. The ones that belong to every war and every distance and every night when someone is far away and someone else is waiting. "I am still here. Come home soon. Rest now." The story has a little further to go. But you can drift, if you want to. You can let the letters carry you. All the way home. Still here. The night is deep now. Whatever hour it is the quiet hour, the one that belongs to nobody, that sits between the last of the evening and the first of the morning, dark and still and entirely its own. Let yourself be in it. There is nothing required of you in this hour. Nothing to do, nothing to decide. Just the dark and the quiet and this voice, and the story moving slowly toward its end. We're moving forward in time now. Not by much. Just a few days. Just enough to see what the 15th of September looked like from a little distance, from the world outside the battle, from the people who hadn't been there but who were about to find out what had happened. The newspapers got hold of it on the 17th. 2 days after the battle, 2 days in which the military censors and the press office and the various layers of official communication had been working out what to say and how to say it, the story of the tanks broke into the public press. Not with the full detail. Not with numbers of machines or technical specifications or anything that could be genuinely useful to the enemy. But with enough to make the thing real, to give it shape, to let the people at home understand that something new had happened. The Times ran it on the front page. The headline used the word landships, one of the early names that had been considered for the tanks before tank had settled into use, and which had a quality of slightly bewildered description about it, as though the writer was reaching for a category that didn't quite exist and had found the nearest available one. Landships. Ships that moved on land. The analogy of the sea, the familiar vastness made navigable by iron, it was not a bad reaching, given that nobody had a better word yet. The public read it. And the public's response was, in its way, as interesting as the soldiers' response had been, more various, less contained, spread across a whole society rather than concentrated in the particular intensity of the front line. In Yorkshire, in a house with a garden and a river that froze every January, Thomas's mother read the newspaper account on the morning of the 17th. She read it at the kitchen table, the same table where she would later read Thomas's letter. The paper was a day old. The village got the papers a day late as a matter of course. She read about the landships, about the advance at Fleurs, about a tank walking down the high street of a French village with British soldiers cheering behind it. She read it twice. And then she sat very still for a moment, with the paper on the table in front of her and the sound of the kettle beginning to come to a boil on the range, and she thought about Thomas. She thought, he was there. She didn't know this. She had no way of knowing, not yet, His letter was still in the military postal system, still making its way back across the Channel and up through England toward her. But she felt it. The way mothers feel things. The way the particular combination of large iron machines and the Somme and 15th of September assembled itself in her chest into a certainty that was not knowledge but was not nothing. She poured her tea. She sat with it. She read the article a third time. And she thought, he saw them. He followed them. He is still alive. And then, because she had learned over 14 months the discipline of not thinking too far ahead, he was alive on the 15th of September. That is what I know. That is enough for today. She drank her tea. She went out to the garden. In London, the response was louder. The newspapers had, by the second day, discovered the story's full possibilities and were running with them completely. Illustrations appeared, artists' impressions of the tanks, based on descriptions and, in some cases, on actual photographs that had been approved for publication, showing the angular iron shapes crossing trenches, pushing through wire, advancing on German positions. The public was fascinated. After 2 years of a war that had been, from the civilian perspective, largely characterized by enormous casualty lists and very small movements on maps, here was something that felt different. Here was a machine, a British machine, invented in Britain, built in Britain, crewed by British men, that had done something new. Something that felt, if you read the accounts in the right mood, like progress. Like the possibility of an ending. The word tank entered common use in these days. Where it had previously been a code word, the machines had been transported and discussed under the cover of that innocuous-sounding label, a storage vessel, nothing to worry about. It was now simply what they were called. Tanks. The word had a quality to it that landships lacked, shorter, more percussive, more immediately solid. It sounded like what it was. A tank. Heavy. Contained. Not going anywhere without deciding to. The word has been in use ever since. In the workshops and factories of England, specifically in Lincoln and Birmingham and the other places where the Mark I had been built, the engineers and workers who had made these machines read the newspaper accounts with a feeling that was complex and quiet and not entirely comfortable. They had built something that was in the newspapers. That had, by all accounts, worked. That had crossed no man's land and walked down the high street of a French village and come out the other side. The thing they had been asked to make had done the thing it was meant to do. But the accounts also mentioned the ones that had broken down. The mechanical failures. The tracks that had shed, the engines that had seized, the 22 machines that hadn't made it to the starting line or had stopped before they'd done their work. The engineers read these parts carefully, without defensiveness, with the particular focused attention of people for whom a failure is not a judgment but a problem with a cause, and causes have solutions. They were already making changes. The Mark II and Mark III were in production, incorporating the lessons of the first deployment. The Mark IV, which would fight at the Battle of Messines in June 1917 and at Cambrai in November of the same year, would be a substantially more reliable machine, thicker armor, improved engine access, a better designed fuel system. The progression was already in motion. Technology doesn't stand still. This is one of its defining qualities. Every failure teaches something. Every breakdown is a lesson that goes back into the design. The tanks that broke down on the Somme on the 15th of September were not simply failures, they were data. And the people who knew how to read that data were already reading it. Thomas learned about the newspaper coverage from Davies, who had somehow obtained a copy of the Daily Mail 4 days after the battle and was reading it with the expression of a man encountering an interesting alternate version of events. "We're heroes," Davies said, in his dry Welsh way. "Apparently." Thomas looked at the paper. There was an illustration, an artist's impression of a tank advancing on a German trench, very dramatic, the machine much cleaner and more purposeful-looking than any tank Thomas had actually seen, which had all been covered in mud and somewhat less dramatic in appearance. "That doesn't look much like them," Thomas observed. "No," Davies agreed. "The ones I saw were muddier. And slower. And one of them was on fire." Thomas read some of the article. The language was elevated, assured, certain in a way that battlefield experience made hard to share. The iron monsters sweeping all before them. The terror of the German defenders. The decisive new weapon. "It's not wrong," Thomas said eventually, carefully. It just isn't all of it. Davies considered this. No, he said. It never is. He folded the paper and gave it to a man who hadn't read it yet. The letters from home, when they arrived in the days following the battle, reflected the newspaper coverage, tentatively, carefully, in the way that people at home reflected the war back to the men in it. Thomas's mother wrote, "I read about the new machines in the paper. I thought of you immediately. I hope you are safe. I hope they are helping." This letter reached Thomas on the 26th of September, 11 days after the battle. He read it in a new trench. The line had moved again, as it always moved, the grinding forward motion continuing. He read it and thought about his mother reading the newspaper account and thinking of him and not knowing, not yet, that he'd been there. Had followed one. Had put his hand on a cold hull in the afternoon and felt the scratches where the bullets had skated across. He wrote back that same day. "Dear Mother. Yes. I was there. I am well." And in Stuttgart, in a town that Thomas would never visit, where a bakery had been standing for 30 years and a small girl named Hilda was learning to walk, Martha Baumann read the German accounts of the battle. The German press framed it differently from the British. The emphasis was on the successful defensive response, the orderly withdrawal, the line held in the end. There was acknowledgement of the new British machines, they could hardly be denied, but the tone was analytical rather than alarmed. A new challenge, to be met with German ingenuity and resolve. Between the lines of this official framing, Martha read what she needed to read. That there had been a battle. That Friedrich's section had been in it. That she had not received a telegram, the black telegram, the one that nobody wanted to receive, and that his last letter had said "I will be home." She believed him. She had to believe him. She held Hilda and looked out the window at the street, at the ordinary town going about its ordinary morning, and she believed him. The world outside the battle learning about the battle. Mothers reading newspapers. Engineers reading failure reports. Soldiers reading about themselves in accounts that were true and not true simultaneously. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the letters. Moving between the two worlds. Carrying what they could carry. Leaving out what was too heavy for paper. Thomas's letter is on its way to Yorkshire. Friedrich's letter is on its way to Stuttgart. Both of them saying the same essential thing, in different languages, to different people. I am still here. The night deepens around us. We're almost at the end of the story now. Almost, but not quite. There are two more things to say. They can wait until morning. Or until the next quiet night. But they will be here, when you're ready. Rest now. We're nearly at the end. The story has one more segment after this one. A quiet one, a gentle one, an ending that I think you'll find restful. But before we get there, we need to look at what came after. At the long shape that the 15th of September cast forward into the years that followed. Because some days are ordinary days. They happen and they pass and they leave no particular mark on the world beyond the small circle of people who live them. And some days are hinges. The 15th of September, 1916, was a hinge. The war had 2 more years to run after Fleur's Corslet. 2 years. It is important not to let that number become abstract. 2 years is a long time. 2 more winters in the mud. 2 more summers of fighting. The battles of Arras, of Messings, of Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, which would consume the summer and autumn of 1917 and leave a name, Passchendaele, that became synonymous with a particular kind of muddy, attritional horror. The spring offensive of 1918, when Germany made its last great push westward and came, for a time, terrifyingly close to breaking the Allied line. The 100 Days offensive that followed, which finally did break the German line, and the armistice of the 11th of November, 1918. 2 more years. Thomas survived them. He was wounded once, in the spring of 1917, a shell fragment that caught him in the left shoulder and sent him back to a field hospital for 3 weeks and then to England for another 6, the longest stretch of home he would have in the entire war. He spent those weeks in Yorkshire, in the house with the garden, and his mother fed him and fussed over him and did not ask about things he didn't want to talk about. Arthur, his brother, was 17 by then and asked questions that Thomas answered as honestly as he could without giving the boy nightmares. He went back. He was there at the end. He was standing in a trench on the Western Front on the 11th of November, 1918, when the guns stopped. He would describe this moment, later, as the strangest thing he had ever experienced, stranger than the tanks, stranger than anything. The silence. After 4 years of a world that had been, at every moment, full of the noise of war, the silence that fell at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November was something he could not fit into any category his mind already had. It was too total, too sudden, too enormous. He stood in it for a long time. Then he sat down. Then he cried. He was not ashamed of this. He noted it, in the journal he kept fitfully, without judgment. I sat down and cried for about 10 minutes. I think most of the men did. Then we looked at each other and nobody quite knew what to do next. Friedrich also survived. He was wounded twice, once in late 1916, once in the spring of 1918, and spent time in military hospitals on both occasions, and returned to the line on both occasions, and was at the front when the armistice came. He walked home. Literally walked, for part of the journey. The collapse of the German military infrastructure in November 1918 meant that transport was disrupted and unreliable, and Friedrich and several men from his unit covered the first stages of the journey home on foot, moving east through a landscape that was making the slow, complicated adjustment from a war zone back to something that resembled ordinary Europe. He reached Stuttgart in December. He came to the door of the house and knocked. He hadn't been able to send word in time, and Martha didn't know he was coming, and the door opened and there she was. He had promised her, in a letter from a trench on the Somme, that he would be home. He was home. Hilda, who was 4 years old and had only the most fragmentary memories of her father, looked at this stranger on the doorstep and then at her mother's face and understood, in the way that small children understand things, that this was something important. She held out her arms. Friedrich picked her up. He stood in the doorway of his father's bakery, holding his daughter, smelling the bread. The tanks had a history after the 15th of September. It moved quickly, as military technology always moves, accelerated by the pressure of necessity, by the knowledge that the other side was watching and learning and developing their own responses. The Battle of Cambrai, in November 1917, was the first time tanks were used in truly large numbers. 476 of them, in a single concentrated assault on a narrow front, not scattered across miles of Somme in small groups, but massed, used as a weapon system rather than a supplement to infantry. The advance on the first day of Cambrai covered, in some sectors, more ground than the entire Somme offensive had managed in 4.5 months. The cavalry that had been waiting since 1914 for the gap that never opened, finally, at Cambrai, they rode through. Not for long. The gap closed again. The German counterattack recovered much of the ground. Cambrai was not the decisive breakthrough it had briefly appeared to be. But it demonstrated something that could not be undemonstrated. It proved, with 476 machines rather than 27, what the machines could do when properly used. And in August 1918, the 100 days, the final offensive, the lesson was applied at full scale. 452 tanks at Amiens. The Germans called August the 8th, 1918, the Schwarztag, the Black Day of the German Army. The line broke. The war moved again, rapidly, westward, eastward, rather, toward Germany, and it did not stop moving until November. The tanks had helped break it. Not alone. Never alone. The war was won by infantry and artillery and logistics and the slow, grinding pressure of blockade and attrition and the arrival of American forces. But the tanks were part of it. A real and growing part. And the lesson that had been partially learned on the Somme on the 15th of September was, by 1918, fully applied. The argument about whether Haig had been right to use the tanks at Flers-Courcelette, too few, too early, sacrificing the element of surprise for a limited gain, continued for years. Continues still, in the sense that military historians continue to debate it. The other side of the argument, that waiting was its own cost, that the Somme was happening and any advantage was worth taking, that the psychological effect on both Allied and German forces of the tank's debut justified the deployment, also continued. There is no clean answer. What there is, instead, is the weight of what actually happened. The tanks were used. They achieved what they achieved. The men who had faced them, and the men who had followed them, and the men who had been inside them, all went on to carry that experience forward into the rest of the war and the rest of their lives. And the engineers who had built them went on to build better ones. And the commanders who had used them went on to use them better. And the story of the machine that had walked down the high street of Flers became, slowly, the story of a new kind of war. Thomas thought about the tanks for the rest of his life. He went back to Yorkshire after the war. He worked for a time in the family business, a small hardware shop that his father had run and that he now helped run, and then, in the 1920s, he trained as a school teacher. He taught for 30 years. History, mostly. He was, by all accounts, an unusual teacher of the subject, less interested in dates and names than in the texture of things, the way events felt from the inside, the human scale of large occurrences. He never taught the First World War directly. It was too close. Too complicated. He had been in it and the children he taught had not, and the gap between those two things seemed to him unbridgeable in the context of a classroom. He taught other things, earlier periods where the distance was sufficient to allow a kind of clarity. But occasionally, when a student asked, when a bright-eyed boy or girl stayed after class and said, "Sir, were you in the war? What was it like?" he would think for a moment and then say, always, the same thing. It was like nothing I expected. And one morning, very early, I followed an iron machine across broken ground, and the wire opened for us, and we walked through. And I thought, something has changed. The world has shifted and I can feel it. And I was right. And I was also, in ways I couldn't see that morning, very, very wrong about what that meant. The students would look at him, not quite understanding. He never explained further. He thought they'd understand it eventually, in their own time, in their own way. The chalk is still there. Under the fields of the Somme, under the rebuilt villages and the quiet cemeteries and the poppy fields that bloom in season and the roads that carry tourists now to memorials and museums, the chalk lies, as it has always lain, undisturbed. Patient. White. The craters have filled in. The trenches have largely collapsed. The wire has rusted and been ploughed under and exists now only in small pieces in the soil, surfacing occasionally when a field is ploughed deep after heavy rain. The broken tanks sank into the mud and the mud took them, and what remains of them is deep down, below the reach of ordinary things. But the chalk remembers. The chalk holds everything in its quiet, geological memory, the shells and the boots and the brass of spent cartridges and the bones, always the bones, still being found, still being identified sometimes, still being given funerals. The chalk holds all of it without judgment, without grief, without anything except the patient indifference of stone that has been waiting since before there were people to walk over it and will be waiting long after. It is not a comforting thing, exactly. But it is a real thing. And real things, even hard real things, have their own kind of comfort. The world is very old. This particular catastrophe, which felt, to the people inside it, like the end of everything, was not the end of everything. Life continued. The villages were rebuilt. Hilda Baumann grew up and had children of her own. Thomas Whitmore taught history for 30 years and died in 1971, in Yorkshire, in autumn, having seen things that he never quite managed to explain. The world is very old. And it has survived a great deal. Let me tell you where Thomas is. It is October, 1971. He is 80 years old. He is sitting in a chair by the window of a house in Yorkshire, not the house he grew up in, which was sold long ago, but a house he has lived in for 40 years, that smells of books and tea and the particular accumulated warmth of a long life lived in the same rooms. The window looks out over a garden. The garden is past its summer now. October has done what October does, taken the color down a little, pulled the warmth back, left the trees with their first yellowing. But it is a good garden. It has been a good garden for 40 years. He has grown things in it. Potatoes, sometimes, which made him think of his mother. He is old. He is very, very old in the way that people are old who have seen a great deal and put a great deal down and are now, finally, at a stage of life where the putting down is almost complete. Where the weight of the years has become not heavy but light. Where the things that mattered most have settled to the bottom and the things that mattered less have dissolved, and what remains is simple and clear. He is sitting by the window. He is watching the garden. He thinks about the 15th of September sometimes. Less often than he used to. In the years immediately after the war, it visited him often. The noise of it, the smell of it, the particular quality of the grey light that morning. Dreams, sometimes. Not nightmares exactly, though there had been those too in the early years. Just, the morning arriving again, the way mornings do, and finding him back in it. That had faded, over time. The way all things fade, eventually. Not disappearing but receding. Becoming part of the landscape of the past rather than an active presence in the present. Becoming, slowly, history. He is a history teacher. Was a history teacher for 30 years. He knows what history does to things. How it changes their texture. How something that was immediate and present and overwhelming becomes, with distance, a shape. A line on a map. A date in a book. Something a student can look at from the outside and try to imagine the inside of. He could never quite do it. Bridge that gap. Make the inside available to people who hadn't been there. He had tried, in small ways, the occasional answer to a student who stayed after class, the occasional conversation with Arthur's children, who asked questions their father had told them to ask. He had tried to give them the texture of it, the smell of the chalk, the weight of the letter in his pocket. He was never sure how much had crossed the distance. He thinks, perhaps that's all right. Perhaps some things are meant to be experienced by the people who experience them and remembered by the people who remember them, and eventually, when the last of those people is gone, to become something different. Something that belongs to everyone and no one. Something that lives in books and films and stories told in the dark. Something like this. He thinks about what it meant. The larger meaning of it. He taught history for 30 years and he has had a long time to think about what things mean, and he has arrived at the conclusion, provisional as all conclusions are, but held with some confidence, that the meaning of a thing is never just one thing. The tanks meant efficiency of killing. That is true and must not be evaded. They were weapons. They were designed to help one side defeat another side, and the means of that defeat included a great deal of death. They were not neutral. They were not innocent. And they shortened the war, probably. Not by themselves, not simply, but as part of the accumulation of advantages that eventually tipped the balance in 1918. Fewer years of war means fewer years of dying. The arithmetic is horrible in every direction you run it. And they were extraordinary. The people who made them, who drove them, who commanded them, the engineers in the factories in Lincoln and Birmingham, the crews sweating in the heat and the fumes, the commanders navigating by compass and periscope through smoke and chaos, they did something that had never been done before. They brought a new thing into the world. And new things, even when they are frightening things, even when they are weapons, carry in them something that is not reducible to their immediate purpose. Something about the human capacity to imagine and build and do. He holds that. The way he always held things, not tightly, not desperately, but present to it. Grateful for it. And Friedrich. He never knew Friedrich. He never knew his name or his town or the bakery or Hilda or any of it. He didn't know, that afternoon in the captured trench, that there was a man a mile away who was doing the same accounting he was doing. Who was putting the same things in the same temporary places. Who was carrying the same essential weight in a different language. He knows it now, in the sense that he has thought about it for 50 years and has understood, in the way that time allows understanding, that there was a Friedrich. That there was always a Friedrich. That on the other side of every wire, in every trench, on every morning of that war and all the wars before it and after it, there was a Friedrich. Doing his duty. Afraid in ways he couldn't write home about. Keeping his promise. He hopes Friedrich made it home. He believes he did. He has no reason for this belief except the stubbornness of hope, which is its own kind of reason, and which has served him adequately for 80 years. He believes Friedrich made it home to Stuttgart. He believes Hilda held out her arms. The garden is very still. Occasionally a bird moves in the yellow tree at the end of it. A blackbird, maybe. Something small and dark and purposeful, doing what birds do in October, attending to the business of its small life with complete and admirable focus. Thomas watches it. He is very tired. Not the exhausted tiredness of the Somme, that particular bone-deep weariness of a body asked to do too much for too long. This is a different kind. The tiredness of a long life, nearly complete. The tiredness of a man who has done what he was given to do and done it as well as he could and is now, in the long October afternoon, ready to rest. He is not frightened. This surprises him, sometimes, when he notices it. He was frightened for years, during the war, and for years after, in ways that were not always visible and not always named. But he is not frightened now. He has the strange, calm feeling of a man who has been somewhere difficult and come out the other side and looked back at the distance he has covered and thought, I did that. I went through that. And here I am. Here he is, 80 years old, in a garden in Yorkshire, watching a blackbird in an October tree. There is a version of Thomas Whitmore in the records. Not Thomas specifically. Thomas is composite, a character built from the accounts of many men, many soldiers, many voices. But the men he is built from are real. Their letters are in archives. Their diaries, where they kept them. Their service records, dry and factual, listing dates and ranks and wounds and the units they served in. Their names on memorials. They are real. And the thing that Thomas felt that morning, the thing he tried to describe to Carrick, the feeling of something shifting, the world changing shape, that is also in the records. Not in those words, not exactly, but in the accumulated weight of the accounts. Men who had been at Fleur's Courcelet writing, years later, about that morning. About following the tanks. About the wire opening. About the feeling of something new arriving in the world. History is made of moments. And some moments are larger than they look from inside them. The 15th of September, 1916, was one of those moments. Not the most important day of the war. Not the turning point, not the decisive engagement. But a hinge. A place where something turned. Where a new thing entered the world and could not be taken back out of it. Where the future, in some small but permanent way, became different from what it would have been otherwise. Thomas didn't know that, in the full sense, that morning. He knew something was changing. He could feel the shift. But the full dimensions of the shift, the tanks of Cambrai, the Black Day at Amiens, the century of armored warfare that would follow, the conversations still ongoing between the tank and the weapon designed to stop it, all of that was invisible to him, in the smoke, in the grey September light. He just followed the iron thing. He just walked through the wire. He just kept going. And now the story is done. The 15th of September is over. Thomas is in his garden. Friedrich is in Stuttgart, or was, wherever he is now, he kept his promise. The chalk is under the fields of the Somme, patient and white. The Mark-I tanks are in museums, some of them. One is in Bovington, in Dorset, a place that calls itself the Tank Museum, which is exactly what it is. You can go and see it. You can walk around it and see the angular hull and the spansons and the tracks, and you can put your hand on the metal, cold now, museum cold, very far from the heat of a Daimler engine in a September battle, and feel what Thomas felt in the afternoon, in the dip in the ground. Something that was here. Something that was real. Something that changed the shape of things. Let the story rest now. Let Thomas rest by his window, watching the blackbird. Let Friedrich be home, in the bakery, in the smell of bread in the early morning. Let the chalk be what it is, patient and white and full of everything it holds. And let yourself rest. The night is very deep now. Whatever hour it is the still point of it, the place where the night has fully arrived and hasn't yet begun to think about leaving. You are here. You are warm. You are safe. The story is over. Or rather, it isn't over, because these stories never quite end, they just become part of the ground, part of the chalk, part of the deep and patient memory of the world. But for tonight it is complete. And you can rest. You can sleep. The iron machines are quiet. The fields are still. The chalk remembers. Good night.